Hi, everyone. This lecture is going to take a look at some of kind of a review of chapter 11 a little bit, where the decline of the church is discussed, but also applying that to some of the reforms that people attempted to make within the church, and also how that's going to affect life and society, familial relations, those kinds of things. So, reasons for the decline of the church. So most of this should be a review based on last chapter, but we see the rise of secular monarchies. So these monarchies that rise up that aren't necessarily tied to a specific religion. We see conflict with individual monarchs. Boniface VIII is the example here. This is the unum sanctum, who has the ability to make appointments governmentally and then within each government religiously. Who are the bishops, etc. Does the king have the power or does the pope? There's quite a bit of political wrangling going on between these two guys. We see opposition to the remnants of the Inquisition. Does the church have total autonomy anymore, or are people starting to kind of rise up within these different governments and say, well, this should be something that falls under government control instead? The hypocrisy of church leaders and corruption is discussed. We saw this a little bit with Dante, Dante's Inferno, which I don't know if I mentioned this prior, but it's not actually called Dante's Inferno or the Divine Comedy. It was originally just called the Comedy. But then, again, one of those vernacular contemporaries, Giovanni Boccaccio, is the one who actually starts entitling it the Divine Comedy, which then leads to a little bit more prestige for Dante. But at any rate, the excerpt that you read dealt with simony, the idea that you could pay for church positions. What exactly does this have to do with God? How does paying for a particular position within the church, how is that going to develop one's devotion to their religion? How is it going to develop devotion to the sacraments? And so we see that corruption going on within the church. If we look at eventually the split, you see church leaders being forced to choose sides during the Great Schism and the papacy at Avignon. And these kinds of things are really kind of tearing down the once mighty and powerful Catholic Church. We saw a loss of confidence in the church resulting from the Black Death. People no longer willing to say, okay, the church has my full confidence that I will do whatever they ask. That's not really going on any longer. And then increased diversity, and this is kind of a lot of mumbo jumbo, but I think I just got excited in writing this. We're moving out of just one person or one entity declaring what knowledge is or how knowledge is derived. This is the O and poison, objective knowledge and subjective visions. How is it created? How is knowledge spread? We're leading closer and closer towards the Renaissance. We see the use of reason. We saw Occam, William of Occam. We saw Petrarch, these gentlemen who are saying, hold on, wait a minute. Knowledge is not necessarily just gained from people telling you what it is and memorizing it. It's actually gained from personal experience, that you can use logic and reason to guide you. These are things that have not really been seen before. And so this is opening up a new world to people looking to learn both religiously and academically. We're going to take a look at some traditional church dissenters. This is late Middle Ages, and this is into eventually the Renaissance. Burghers and Beguines, we sometimes see these terms listed on the exam, which is the only reason I bring them up briefly, but it really helps to exemplify a larger movement taking place. These are lay religious orders, so these are commoners. There are no formal vows. While these people may congregate, in some cases in the Netherlands, into the thousands together, there's no person in charge. There's no vow to be given. There's no exclamation of respect to be handed out. These are just people who get together, and the tenets of what they do is voluntary care of the sick, devotion, looking to not necessarily profit from what they're doing. Again, this is rebelling against some of that simony, some of the sale of indulgences, which we'll get to. They lived in these kind of sort of communes. That'll come up much, much later when we start looking at Thomas More's Utopia and that kind of thing. But they're really just looking to be spiritually connected and do that through their own works. This video, you can just take a peek, just goes into the Inquisition, which leads us into this question. From the Inquisitor's Manual, written about 1310-ish, I'd like you to read this and attempt to answer that question. So you can pause the video at this point, take a look through, and see what is the answer to this multiple choice question. So hopefully you took a look, took your time, and found that the answer is in fact B, access to knowledge. Who should hold the keys to knowledge? Is it the Roman Catholic Church, or are people able to use their own knowledge, use writings on religious subjects to kind of develop their own religious personality? So there are two other early reformers besides the groups that we mentioned. John Wycliffe, he's an Oxford religious professor, and he is rebelling against the lavish lifestyle of those within the Catholic Church, and he speaks out against it. He writes a number of books that become popular and spread all over. And Jan Hus is the other one. He's Czech, so this is kind of Holy Roman Empire-ish, and he's rebelling against the sale of indulgences and also the politicism of the Catholic Church during this time period. Pope shouldn't be making calls on religion just to make them relative to his political position. And so both of these men speak out, and these early reformers, they kind of form the foundation for the people who are going to come later, like Martin Luther. We see some class changes, sort of. The nobility is still running the show, and they're unwilling to give it up. We saw that with the peasant revolts in the last chapter. The peasant revolts, some minor successes in some cases, especially in England, but ultimately there isn't any long-lasting major change to the peasant class from those revolts. Merchants, they're going to stabilize the economy after the Black Death and kind of kickstart the economy again. That's going to lead to increased wealth and status. And I hesitate even to use this phrase, but the middle class, there is no middle class until really the 1800s. And you could make the argument even into the 1900s in most places. But you're seeing a difference. You're seeing all of these people who are not nobility, who all of a sudden are gaining access to wealth. And that's going to be a major push. That's why we see, to at least a small degree, the English parliamentary reform that was discussed in the last chapter as well. The tradesmen, as we saw, they are willing to kind of band together and fight to try and gain some sort of small rights within this, saying we are no longer serfs. This is no longer that feudalist hierarchy. We can't be constrained by that traditional system any longer. But for the unskilled peasants, they're kind of stuck in the same pattern that they had been before. Marriage is going to be affected by the changes brought from the Black Death. After the Black Death, it takes the city of London and England as a whole, really, about 150 years for the birth rate to increase back to where it was pre-Black Death levels. And the reason for this is people didn't want to bring children into a world where the bouts of plague were still happening periodically. And so there was a real reluctance to create these larger scale families as they once did. But once that happens, once marriage starts beginning, really for women, they're asked to give up any individual rights that they had and become subservient to the man. And this is something that's not just expressed within the family itself. We see this affect procedural law. We see it affect business and economics. Women weren't supposed to take over their husband's business if the husband died because they were viewed as incapable of doing so. They're not going to be able to run the business the same way, so why should they have those rights? The same thing goes in terms of religion, the idea being that you are supposed to be subservient to your man. So for the ladies, no real increases in terms of rights taking place there. What I'd like you to do now is really take about 10 minutes to analyze the peasant wedding. This is 1567. This is Peter Bruegel the Elder. And I'd like you to try and examine who these people are, knowing what you know about the title. Peter Bruegel, this is going to be the Low Countries, which are Netherlands, Belgium, etc. This is coming from the Northern Renaissance, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But what do you see? What do you observe? What are some inferences you can make? Please take seriously, I want you to spend with partners or with small groups about 10 minutes going through this together to see what you can discover. We zoom in a little bit here, you can see a little bit closer, make it a little bit easier for you to kind of make some things out. But please take your time and go through there. You don't necessarily have to write anything down, but I really want you to try and explore the space, explore the people, explore why the artist painted things a certain way. Take your time and go ahead and do that.